we might, if you're willing to perform in any way, we're open to it. Awesome. Alex, you want to kick us off?
Yeah, be my pleasure. So my name's Alex. I'm gonna start by introducing our speaker, Mr. Ramsey Homsany. He has actually a very illustrious career, and something that made me smile is you grew up in both Athens, Greece, and Sparta, New Jersey.
Yeah.
So those cities usually don't often go together, but you managed to hit both of them together. From there, you went to Rutgers University, where you majored in chemical as well as biochemical engineering. Took a pretty interesting path afterwards and went to NYU for his JD, where he then worked at one of the preeminent technology firms, patent law, technology law firms, Wilson Sonsini, where he was a technology attorney. So he understands the legal landscape and as well as the nitty-gritty of what goes behind the background of what startups have to go through very well. From there, he progressed from Wilson Sonsini to be a vice president at Google, where he managed many of their legal avenues. And actually from Google went to, as many people with the connection to SBC have in common, went to Dropbox, where he was an executive during the period of time where Dropbox growth exploded. During his tenure at Dropbox, Dropbox brought in over 1 billion in capital, as well as registered 500 million users. And it was actually when Ramsey was at Dropbox that Dropbox got, I believe, over a billion in capital, being the first SaaS company to do so. Since then, Ramsey.
We also acquired a company called Pove, run by Aditya
Yes.
Ruchi.
Yes.
Another milestone in the company's history.
Indeed. So everybody can kind of see where these interactions are coming from. But since then, Ramsey has also become the president of Octant, which is a modern biotechnology company focused on small molecules, design and delivery, which is quite a fascinating move, as well as it just kind of demonstrates the diversity of command of subjects and abilities he has. And so with that, I do have questions that we'll go through. But at any point, Ramses, if you want to kind of pivot into any topic of interest that you feel is important for the community to know, please, feel free to do so. The questions are kind of just kind of guiding questions, but there's no requirement to get through any of them. And the conversation, if it kind of evolves, we'll let it go there. And then the community as well, if you have a question, please put it in the chat. Both me and Gerda will be monitoring the chat, but we'll go through. And so, Ramses, I gave my version of the introduction, but please take any time now to kind of discuss your background and where you came from.
No, yeah, I think that intro works for me. There's obviously a lot of twists and turns along the way, which I'm happy to get into in response to people's questions. But generally, I've just always been just fascinated by the intersection of society and technology. I think if there's a key theme in my career, it's been trying to assemble and work with just extraordinarily talented groups of people in order to build things that seem sort of outrageously ambitious at the time that they're being conceived and built. Yeah, I'll leave it at that, and I'm happy to get into detail at the different milestones of those of that path.
Awesome, thank you. So I think one of the things that the community is probably interested in, so South Park Commons is moving towards the biotech space, but for the most part, this is kind of a space that has traditionally been known to have kind of a gatekeeper mentality. So there's a high barrier to entrance in that field of technology. Some say that is because of like the domain knowledge, which is definitely true to get into biotech, but there also is other things that potentially could be gatekeeper or keep people out of the community, such as advanced degrees or connections already to like established pharma or biotechnology companies. So our first question is, when you entered the biotech company, what did you find that was unique to that industry? And did you feel that coming in as a lawyer, as a JD, did you feel that was an asset to you, or did you feel that there was some pushback on that?
Yeah, great questions. I'll answer it in a few different ways. So the first one is being a lawyer is not just in biotech, but in tech generally, is both a huge asset and also can be pigeonholing if you let others pigeonhole you. So I think one of the things I learned very early on at Google was that as we moved into a information-centric world, a lot of what it means to design and distribute and maintain and service products in a bits world is very virtual. And so lawyers are trained to, in a very systematic and thorough way, sort of engineer idea systems and engineer concept systems. And so I remember Eric Schmidt once saying, someone asked Eric Schmidt about headcount, and he was responding, and there are some teams at the company that have unconstrained headcount. One of them is the legal department, because if we keep hiring people like that, we find them in the product orgs, we find them in the engineering orgs, like they just have this way of really helping the company in lots of different ways because they're so good at dealing with ambiguity and constraining problems that seem on their surface unconstrained. And I found that to be the case in the technology areas I've worked in. The flip side is, yeah, like if you behave like a stereotypical lawyer, you'll get pigeonholed like one, right? Like if you do things like create restrictions out of fear and paranoia, or one of the things that I found lawyers can do in industry sometimes is scare people off of ideas by sort of implicit threats, like, oh, we shouldn't do that. Someone could go to jail for that, or that's illegal. And then the question has to be like, is it a theoretical possibility that someone could go to jail for this? Or is it just like, just one remote possibility? Because if it's a remote possibility and it's not an ethically problematic or a wrong or an illegal thing to do, then you shouldn't be running around scaring people about things just because you're a lawyer. You should actually be informing them about what the constraints are, what the law is, helping advise them. Because, there's just lots of judgment calls in business. And don't get me wrong, I think not just as a lawyer, as any employee, you should absolutely be stopping unethical and things that are wrong. But that's different than what I have found, and I found this to be the case in biology as well, is people who have very specialized knowledge. It's sometimes tempting to sort of weaponize that knowledge in a way that makes you default right, because the other person can't even compete. The other person just doesn't have access to your ivory tower, whether you're a PhD in some narrow section of biology or whether you're a JD. So that was a very long-winded way of answering the lawyer question, the lawyer part of the question. What was the other part of the question? The first part of the question was, about restrictions in the field. Yeah, I think there are three sort of gatekeeping functions, and I'm being overly simplistic, that I have detected in biology. And I think two of them, well, I'll say one of them is actually replete across many areas of technology that are not pure software, and that's just distribution models that live in atoms. And what I mean by that is there's been a profound explosion of startups over the past 20 years. Companies like Google and Facebook have changed the world. I do think sometimes we have had hubris about how difficult moving into areas where bits actually really matter, atoms really matter, how complicated that can make a business. And I think that exists in biology the way it exists in other industries as well, whether that's trying to put things into space or whether that's even just, like trying to run a new kind of specialty chemicals company using synthetic biology. Part of the challenge there is just that the chemical infrastructure on this planet is extremely specialized. It's highly optimized. It exists in a very sort of, there's a history to it. There's an industrial structure to it, and breaking into that and understanding it and competing in it is very difficult in a way that operating in a pure software world, there's some of that in the pure software world too. And I think we're seeing more of it now that there are things like app stores where you have to navigate politics and approval structures, but it's not quite the same as being restricted in the atoms world. The other two categories, sorry, I know this is a bit long-winded, are one, you're at least in biopharmaceuticals, you're in a highly regulated environment, and that's for good reason, right? Your products are going to be put into people. And so we need to be very, very, very careful that we don't harm anyone. And then the third sort of gatekeeping function is that biology is incredibly complicated. It's orders of magnitude more complicated, I would argue, than any other technology area. And so that requires a lot of specialization. And so those are three gatekeeping functions that I think often get conflated, and they can be reinforcing of each other. But those are three different sort of axes of gatekeeping that I've found in the industry. I'll stop talking there.
Could I jump in very quick? Hi, Ramsey. I worked at Sanofi, for those who don't know, big biotech, like big pharma. And I was on the tech side, and I did find, I don't have an MD but I was on the tech side, and I did still find that I was treated as a second-class citizen, where like you don't have an MD or some sort of like biomedical engineering degree, even though you're an expert in tech, like you're treated differently. Did you find, I know your undergrad is in like bio related, but did you find you had to sort of work harder to like be in this space, or did you feel like your your experience and like your lawyer side compensated, quote unquote, in others' eyes?
Yeah, I don't think it compensated. I think what you're detecting, I've experienced as well. I think there is a priesthood class in this industry around people with MDs and PhDs. I think it's, some of it comes from good places. A lot of it, again, I think is just like weaponizing, and maybe weaponizing is overly dramatic of a word, but it's gatekeeping. By the way, I found a similar thing in the legal profession. So I think one of my big initiatives at Google was to train non-JDs to do a lot of work in a legal department. And I think some of them did it better than the JDs did. But there was this presumption of, oh, you don't have a JD, you can't do X or Y. And it was like, no, that's nonsense. I've met plenty of people without JDs who can can really, in a sophisticated way, negotiate and edit contracts or give advice or learn about areas of the law, et cetera. Obviously, they shouldn't be practicing law without a license, and that's a whole different discussion. But it's similar in the biotech world where, yeah, I've found that there are certain areas where just I'm not going to get any benefit of the doubt because I don't have a PhD or I don't have an MD. And also, biology is really, really hard, and I've had to spend a ton of time learning biology and some chemistry as well. And so, yes, I've definitely experienced that.
Yeah, thank you for that. And then we do actually have someone with an MD here. So Alex, I realized you didn't give an intro of yourself. If you can like take a few seconds just to set the context of like your background.
And I want to add one thing to that too, by the way. I have also found both in law and in biology that exacerbates other biases as well. I have found that that challenge is tougher for women and underrepresented minorities in both of those fields. And so that's also, I think, something conscious to be conscious of when you're building teams in these areas or when you're working in these fields. Anyway, sorry, I didn't mean to interrupt.
No, as a woman and long-term aspiring founder, I appreciate you calling that out. Thank you.
Awesome. I think that was an awesome answer. Yeah, as Gary mentioned, I do have a medical degree. I also have a PhD in computer science. So unfortunately, I think I have both of those priesthood things. But I actually echo everything that you said. As someone with those degrees, and someone who like works in the biotech sphere, there is absolutely that priesthood, which I think actually is detrimental to that field, because there's the medical degree less so, because that's more of a generalized degree, but with a PhD, the point of that is you become the expert in the field. And with that expertise comes hubris, such that people without that degree or that qualification, people will prematurely close those opinions out. And that's actually how you get into trouble. Like there's no story where hubris ends up winning the day. It's
Right.
always something that like handicaps you. So I totally echo that. But yes, I might have a conflict of interest with those degrees. But to focus more on kind of something you said that I thought was super interesting, actually, and I never thought about this. Your training, essentially, and you mentioned this when you were at Google, but your legal training and your career training has really made you someone who can take in complex information where there's high levels of ambiguity, which is essentially like any startup, and organize that information into systems. So you're able to put order to something that is intrinsically and naturally unordered. How do you feel this skill developed? Obviously, like, you've probably got some like exposure to it through your education, but as someone who's like progressed through their career, how do you feel this skill has developed, and what was kind of most instructive in like getting you to recognize like, wow, this is actually a viewpoint, a perspective that I can bring to problems that really kind of gives me the edge in the situation, or it lets me see through the distractors and really kind of hone in on what's important?
Yeah, so I think this was a sort of a career philosophy, and not just a career philosophy, but a philosophy on sort of how I was going to work in my life that I developed in law school, because I got to law school with an engineering degree, very little education in English or social sciences. My parents were immigrants from the Middle East. My English skills were not as strong as my coworkers, the other students at my law school, and I certainly wasn't the son of all these CEOs and law firm partners that a lot of my colleagues were. So I was just super intimidated at law school. And what I slowly realized was law school was actually a lot like engineering. We have a set of what we would consider natural laws. In engineering, that was like chemistry, physics. The language of it was mathematics. In law school, it was stuff like psychology and sociology. And we have to build systems based on these underlying natural laws. And that means finding a way to measure our systems, making assumptions and abstractions about those systems, and then measuring whether the new things we did, like iterating on that and seeing how it's going. It's just that in law, your underlying natural laws are just way less deterministic than physics and chemistry is. And once I started to look at law school that way, I started to enjoy it a lot more. And in particular, I enjoyed working in the area of law and economics and law and technology. And what I realized was that really and this was advice I'd gotten in law school, which was, hey, I remember asking someone what classes to take, and what they told me to focus on was two things. One, how good is the professor regardless of what they're teaching? And two, you should try to get a diversity of different classes that teach different modes of thinking. So the way you practice constitutional law is very different mode of thinking than the way you practice, for example, administrative law. And so tried to learn different modes of thinking and how to solve problems. And so I realized when I started to think of my world that way, I realized that actually editing contracts was a lot like programming. It was like you have all these subroutines that need to fit into each other. There's common variables that are defined in the contract. I mean, I'm stretching the analogy a little bit, but it's actually remarkably similar. And I found when I got to Google that a lot of what we were doing was like, how do you go into a room full of brilliant people that are just like trying to boil the ocean with all their amazing ideas and start structuring what we're thinking, what our goal is, how we get from here to there, what are the key risks, what are the key opportunities. And that started to feel very natural to me as sort of almost in an engineering problem solving mindset. Now there's some cons to the engineering mindset at times, like they can lead you to really short shrift human behavior. One of my first jobs, my first couple of years at Google, I was sent out to New York and I was the lead lawyer with the ad sales team. And that was like my big education in life on like EQ and human behavior. It was amazing sitting, like it was basically me and 100 salespeople. And it was, the things I learned were just incredible. Even just how the salespeople would try to work me over to get more of my attention on their contracts and stuff it was so educational. But it's really sort of applying that problem solving mindset. I've just found to be powerful in my career, regardless of what discipline or area you're in.
Awesome. Yeah, I think that that type of mindset actually is crucial to any type of startup, but also just any type of problem you face in life. Just recognizing that there's parallels to stuff that you have expertise in, and kind of seeing that there's an image, a reflection of like your experience on whatever you're about to encounter. So I wanted to also kind of touch on something you said a little earlier about I think it was the second gatekeeping issue that I know like it ends up being kind of, and it had to do with regulation, like the FDA specifically. I know that a lot of people who enter biotech or who think about entering biotech, one of the things that actually kind of dissuades them is that exact regulatory nature and like how expensive clinical trials are for one, and all the safety mechanisms you rightfully have to do to get a product to market, and also the timeline that takes. Like with software tech, you can get something to market within weeks or months, but with biotech, sometimes that takes years. In fact, often it takes years to decades. So one of the questions we have is, what do you think like the FDA or the regulatory nature of biotech is like maybe too restrictive, or what do you think is a way that we could improve the innovation in biotech and also the amount of people who want to enter biotech who may otherwise be dissuaded by these kind of overarching regulatory issues? Yeah,
so I won't wax too poetic on whether it's too restrictive or not. I am certain there are a number of ways that the regulatory process for drugs can be improved, if nothing else, just because the system's been around for a long time, and all systems that sort of accrue technical debt over time, and especially government systems. And there's definitely a bunch of stuff that could be better. That being said, I will say there are also a lot of ways that the FDA can move really fast and be amazing. And I think the COVID vaccines are an example of just stunning. I actually don't think the average person really understands how absolutely incredible those vaccines are. That like a virus shows up for the first time in history, within weeks, we've fully sequenced that virus. And, within a year or whatever it is, we have a working vaccine. Like, that's crazy. Some of the best experts in the field thought it would be minimum 10 years before we'd have a vaccine. And so you also got to give the FDA credit for things like that. But I think people shouldn't be too discouraged by this notion that like it takes 10 years to make a drug. That process has actually been unbundled pretty reasonably. It's actually, yes, it's true that it takes a long time for a novel molecule to become an approved drug, but there are lots of well understood and valued milestones along the way that you can build a company or an idea towards. There are companies that got acquired for billions of dollars that weren't even in the clinic yet. There are value inflection point. There's an understood chain of value inflection from the very earliest days of drug discovery to approval, and there is plenty of space in there to execute on ideas, build companies, do very meaningful things in 2, 3, 4-year timeframes. It's not easy; it's very hard, but it's very tractable. That's not the reason I would stay out of the space. And in fact, it's at all sides, like at a very deep tech level, you could be very early in the process and help other companies with drug discovery. And we're seeing lots of even just pure in silico companies nowadays. And then even at the very end, you can do more sort of the health informatics or bioinformatics types plays that are just improve the system, improve clinical trials. I have a friend who has a startup who is doing distributed rare disease clinical trials. They don't develop their own drugs. They're just really improving the process. So I think there's a lot of places for smart people to play along that 10-year cycle. I don't think you have to be, you don't have to see that cycle from beginning to end to have a successful business.
Yeah, I think that's super important actually for people to hear, especially given that the stereotype of the biotech company is essentially it's like Pfizer, Roche, where like from start to finish they have billions of dollars to start, and then they develop, push through trials, and then have this big market drug. And that's like telling a software person like, don't go do this because it's going to take you at least 10 years to build Google. And it's like, you're not trying to build, like, hopefully your thing will become Google one day, but there's a lot between here and there that's worth pursuing and good for society. Awesome.
Sorry, I didn't mean to interrupt you, but
No, that's great. That's great. One question that I'm personally interested in is, so the pivot into biotechnology from Google, from Dropbox, what brought you into biotech? Because I can, your career essentially is very successful at top law firm, very successful at top tech firm, very successful at Dropbox, and then you're very successful now in this biotech, Octant, and what kind of drove you to make that pivot in your career?
Yeah, it was it was very much a process of self-reflection around how I thought I could be most useful to the world, and also be passionate about what I was doing at the same time. And so I went through a process where I was just studying different technology areas, and what had been happening in biology was just blowing my head off. I mean, we've always known on some level that biology is just the most astonishingly complex and sophisticated technology. Some people object to calling it a technology because it wasn't created by people, but anyway, let's call it a technology for now. If you think about it, our brains are roughly 90, I think it's 85 or 86 billion cells. And the things it can do are just unbelievable. We don't understand most of the things it does. We don't know why we sleep, why we dream. And by the way, the thing that fuels that brain is a turkey sandwich. It's just crazy. It's completely nuts. It's your wildest dream of, if you could take a movie like The Matrix and make it 1,000 times stranger, 1,000,000 times stranger, that would be biology, right? And it grows trees that are hundreds of feet tall. It generates mycelial networks that span thousands of square miles. It's mind-blowing what this system does. And at its heart, it's this coupling of an information system, as propagated by genetics and the things that regulate genetics, and and this physical system that it is like recursively instantiated in. And for the first time in history over the last 20 years, we really are starting to get access to that information system. And when I started to see articles about technology, things people like my co-founder were doing that actually were like, you were really starting to access the information layer of biology, program it, edit it. You know, you could do A/B testing in it. Like that was mind-boggling to me. Like that was, you know, it just, as the more I explored that, it just became so abundantly clear to me that nothing was going to change our future as much as us actually being able to manipulate that technology was going to change our future. And so I just got very excited about thinking through, okay, knowing how rapidly this field is changing, how would you build a new type of company to actually harness that change? Like one of the things that my co-founder, one of the analogies my co-founder uses of metaphors, which I think is super powerful, is like, you know, in the last like 7 to 10 years, we've roughly had 30 to 35 years of Moore's law in gene sequencing and gene synthesis. And so imagine you were like a computer programmer in like 1985, and you woke up in 1992 or 93 with computers from like 2015 or computing power from 2015. Like, what would you do? You'd probably actually just like make Excel faster. You'd probably just like make Pong faster. You wouldn't, like the time it would take to actually internalize that immense power that you now have at your fingertips and do things like the iPhone or it would be so much opportunity there. You wouldn't even have enough human cycle time to even start mining in it. And that's where I think we are in biology. Like we all of a sudden have these incredibly powerful resources. We haven't even begun to scratch the surface of what's possible with these technologies. And I just wanted to be a part of that, and not just be a part of it myself, but also find a way that my skills can actually contribute to it. And that's why we founded Octant.
That's amazing. Yeah, I think that's, I echo all of that. And just for the community's context, the genome was sequenced, the full human genome was sequenced in about 2000 to 2002. And gene editing happened in 2012. So 10 years later, after having the sequence, we were able, I'll put a caveat, gene editing happened before then, but CRISPR gene editing 2012. Right. And today, actually, like there's clinical trials where people are hopefully curing genetic disease that people are born with. So within 20 to 22 years, we've gone from knowing what our genome is, and it's vastly smaller than we thought it would be, to potentially curing diseases that otherwise would be impossible to cure. There's no way to cure a genetic disease aside from modifying DNA. And we're within 20 years, within a lifespan, a fifth of a lifespan, we're at that stage. So I completely.
I don't know if you saw the news. I think it was 2 days ago, they transplanted a heart that had been grown in a pig into a human. It's only been a few days, but the transplant is holding. They achieved this by gene editing pig tissue so that this living pig would produce tissue that does not produce some of the proteins and sugars that human body tends to sort of activate its immune system against. Like, that is crazy. Yeah. Like that's something out of a science fiction novel 15 years ago, right? It's really hard to overstate the revolution that's happening in biology right now. It is like, like down the street from here, there's a company that was, synthetically producing spider silk to make fabrics, and they now have a line of fake leather that's made from mycelial tissue. Like you see all the fake meat companies or the other, like it's what's going on. It's just astonishing.
Yeah, it's truly the revolution of our century. So I mean I have like a myriad of questions that I could talk to you all day about. I want to also open it up to the community, like to ask questions directly. I've been checking the chat box. Mostly it's just like
Clever
woohoo for you.
comments.
Yeah, clever comments. But I do want to give the community time now to ask whatever questions they want, and we can go from there.
Are you going to call on people, or do people just?
I think people will just jump in if they have questions.
Okay. So I can go first. So Ramsey, wanted to ask. So how does one get started? Like, say, if you're trying to start a company in this space, it's much harder. The consumer and enterprise SaaS spaces are easier. You can sort of prototype and see what happens, and you can get some feedback from people quickly. How does one get started in this space?
Yeah, it's a really good question. I think the thing you just described, like prototyping, et cetera, there are analogs to that in biology. There's showing things in cell models. There's, you can take model data sets and produce, blinded results to them, or results that are, blind to what the actual results are, et cetera. But I think it does require you to actually, I think a lot of what you guys are doing now at South Park Commons is get involved in a community, right? And start to meet people who have knowledge in that space and get into dialogue with them and find out what the hard problems are and brainstorm new ways to solve those problems. And then think about, like, as you would in a software company, quite frankly, like, how would you de-risk potential solutions to this problem? I'm not saying it's easy, but it's not a 10-year 0 to 1. There are de-risking steps along the way. There are companies being funded in the space nowadays by non-PhDs. It's happening. There's VCs out there who are excited about this space that can help with it. There are lots of founders. I'm happy to help connect people to them who also pay it forward the way founders do in the tech space. There are organizations that are now being formed to really champion founder-led biotech in particular, as sort of distinguished from VC-incubated biotech, which has been the dominant model over the last 15, 20 years. So it's hard for me to give you a one-size-fits-all answer. I think it depends on also what space you're talking about, whether you're talking about sort of, there's like health technology, there's in silico like pharmaceutical biotech, there's wet biotech, there's stuff like Octant, which is truly sort of at the intersection of computation and what I would call wet biotech. And I think it's a matter of meeting people in the space and starting to understand their problems. One of the easy ways to meet people in the space for people like you guys is you all have a lot of talents that a lot of these companies are really starving for in terms of being able to help with software problems and software problem solving. So, like, we're always looking for great software engineers. We're looking to either hire them or just get to know them, meet them, spend time with them. We're very generous. I'm calling myself generous. That's generous, but I think we try to create community around that. Like, it's incredible how much time my co-founder Sri, who's a leading expert in synthetic biology in the world, spends with just people who want to learn about the space. I think one of the things I've been really pleasantly surprised by is that there are some downsides to coming from a space that's so predominantly staffed with people who come out of long academic tracks. One of the upsides is they actually really love to share knowledge and talk about stuff, and the ideas are fast and furious, and it's a lot of fun having these discussions. So I think there is a social element to this of just working your way into the community. I think you already know how to do that based on how you've done it in software. It's about genuinely learning, being curious, and then meeting and talking to people who are also in the areas you're curious about. Hopefully that's not too glib and simple an answer. And I'm happy to answer more sort of like specific follow-ups to it. Did that answer your question?
Yeah, I mean, it's hard, right? And it's a new sort of field. All the challenges you laid out about it being sort of insular from interdisciplinariness, and things like that. Like, I mean, I'm just curious if you had, and you answered it pretty well in terms of, just for context, I was an advisor to Flagship. So to your point about VC incubated things, right? Like, I mean, so I was just curious how we can do more of this outside of that sort of institutional framework. So, so it was nice to hear your thoughts and the openness of some of the West Coast style entrepreneurs on this stuff.
Yeah, there's a lot of that going on. There's a great group out of Boston called Petrie that's trying to champion some of this. Actually, one of our employees, Nicholas, who's our first software engineer, he's starting a Slack community for people interested in sort of biotech software. And I'll put that link in the chat if anyone wants to join that Slack community. And not just for the substance of that community, but I'm guessing you'll meet a lot of people in that community who can also direct you to places. And it's growing and it's growing fast. There are a lot of problems that need to be solved and a lot of work to do at the intersection of computation and biology. So for example, at Octant, we do something called multiplex biology, which is just extremely high throughput programmable biology. It generates a ton of data. Everything we do has a software layer to it. The design of our experiments, the analysis, the DevOps of running our systems. We bring in ML and AI to do generative work on what the next round of experiments should be. And it's not, one of the core principles of our company is we're anti-disciplinary with an E. And what we mean by that is we believe that it's not enough to just be cross-disciplinary. You can't just like put a biology person with a software person and then the magic happens. It's actually that the software person has to start to learn the biology and the biology person has to start to learn the software. And it's only through being able to sort of look through both of those lenses at the same time do you start to really see how powerful the solutions can be. And so there's a lot of community around helping people from both sides of that fence learn more about the other so they can start to really operate in that anti-disciplinary way over time. But it takes hard work, and it's not, you can't sort of show up and be an expert in biology 6 weeks later, that's for sure.
It sounds like Alex knew that this was good advice when he chose both the medical field and computer science.
Yeah.
Nice.
That's a pretty special background to have for sure.
Yeah, it's a lucky strike more than an intentional move.
I'm curious about the origin of Octant and how you guys approach starting that. Did your co-founder have some technology that you guys saw some promise of, or were you seeing a problem and went out and found the technology and built a team to be able to bring it to life? Or, and did you need to have, how important is it to have people in your co-founding team who have a history with a certain, technology? Like a lot of founders in the space come out of university labs or are associated with places where the technology is developed.
Yeah, so I'll give you our story and then we can abstract some lessons from it. So my co-founder, he has been in and out of academia and startups, was at the Broad Institute, then had his own lab at UCLA, and was really one of these original founding scientists in the area that today is called synthetic biology, and did a lot of the early work on basically, one of the key insights he had early in his career was he started as a computer scientist actually and was trying to model things in biology. And what he realized was that with the tools that existed in the late 2000s, it was actually easier to build different versions of a virus and then study the changes than it was to try to build a software program that acted like the virus. And so that pushed him further in the direction of synthetic biology and actually altering the biology and using that as the testing model, rather than trying to build pure software, because there just wasn't, the models weren't constrained enough to actually read on what was actually happening in biology to do it purely from the software. And then through that, he did a lot of foundational work in gene synthesis. He was a foundational player in some of the technologies called talons that eventually worked into CRISPRs. And what he saw in the field was that a lot of people were very excited about synthetic biology as a way to introduce new modalities to medicine. So a modality is something like engineering your genes to edit out a disease, or engineering cells in your body and then putting them back into your body, or engineering them while they're in your body to sort of fight, the sickness in a different way. But he was doing a lot of human genomics research in complex disease. And what he realized was that in those areas, which are a lot of the biggest disease areas in the world, areas like neuro diseases, cardio diseases, metabolic diseases, the diseases are so complex that it's not about, hey, we just need this way to edit this one gene. It's more questions like, is depression one disease? Is it 1,000 diseases that look the same? Like, what are the biochemical pathways in your body that are producing these disease states? And he had this strong sense that, hey, we should be using synthetic biology not just to create modalities, but actually as a very high throughput way to actually probe the information system. These are words I would use, not him. And so the way I think of this as someone coming out of software was like, for the first time in history, we had a really high throughput way to put print statements into the programming of biology, right? So we can engineer these barcodes, we can put them in the various biological pathways of a cell, we can expose that cell to different conditions, and the cell leaves behind what we call genetic barcodes. You could also call them genetic UIDs of these artificially edited, unique strings of RNA that we can read out using a sequencer. And we use that to track what's happening in the cell, but through genetic sequencing, which is extremely cheap now. So gene sequencers, a few $100,000, you can just sequence a lot of genetics with them, and you can, now the experiments you used to do one at a time, because you can attach these genetic tags to them, you can actually run millions of these experiments in a single environment, which generates huge amounts of data. And also that data is is generated in the same experiment using the same conditions. So it also has a lot less noise in it. And so we set off to, hey, what if we built a company around using synthetic biology, not to change modalities, not to do CAR-Ts and gene engineering and disease editing at the genetic level, but actually to read out on what was actually causing diseases, and then use programmable chemistry to treat the diseases in a way that's as complex as the disease itself. And so that was sort of the genesis of the idea of thinking about how you could use these tools in new ways. There was some proprietary technology that came out of his academic lab that we licensed that did enable the company, but I think it was more sort of the mindset. It was that there is a growing movement of people who are practicing in this area of very high throughput multiplex biology, excited about what was possible. We're using both the computational and the biological techniques that it takes to set up these extremely high throughput, and so these experiments generate a ton of data. And so it was assembling a movement around that, and then we did sort of do a lot of thinking about what would be the best place from a commercial perspective to target this platform we wanted to build. And there we had to go get a lot of help from people more in the biopharmaceutical field. But there were a lot of people out there willing to help and talk to us. I think some of that was because he was a professor at UCLA, and so he had a lot of access to a lot of people. You know, there wasn't a VC who was going to turn him down for a conversation, at least. They weren't necessarily going to fund whatever he said, but they were certainly going to listen and talk to him. But I think it was that sort of -1 to 0 journey, as you guys would put it, of trying to figure out even what we would want to do. So that was the technical angle. There was another angle we discussed a lot, which was how, if you built a new type of biotech company that at its heart looked a little more like a software company in the sense that it was going to rely on much more fast moving iteration and data models, and your moat was not necessarily going to be patents and technology, although those are important, but it was going to be how fast you can iterate on experimentation. That was going to look a little more like a software company. And so you'd have to run that company in a slightly different way. You'd have to put technologists at the center of decision-making in that company. These are a lot of the lessons sort of I learned at Google and Dropbox about how to build a company by and for technologists. that we wanted to also apply some of those lessons to building a biotech company. I don't think that answered all of your question, but it answered a chunk of it, and I'm happy to.
That was super helpful. I appreciate it.
Awesome. We're ready to wrap up, but any other questions? I think Noah has his hand up.
Yeah, hi, thanks for the presentation, and apologies if I missed the content of this question at the beginning, so feel free to dismiss. But curious to hear your take on real world evidence and all the stuff that's happening out there. We're getting these really great clinical assays that can characterize what's happening in a lab setting, but there's a lot of interesting information at scale. How do you see the two playing nicely together?
It's a great question. So clearly something, and I'll take a step back for the audience a little bit. One of the things that's just happening over the past 10, 15 years that is just incredibly exciting in biology is two different types of data sets, or a bunch of different types of data sets that are just growing exponentially. One is what are what we call GWAS studies. So population-wide genetic data sets of, you sequenced 500,000 people, and now it's becoming millions of people, and you have their genetic sequences, and you collect as much phenotypic data as you can about the person, and also some environmental data. What medications are they on? What are their physical traits? What diseases might they have or not have? What are all these like biometric conditions about the person? You generate these huge data sets that link genetics to traits, right, and phenotypes. You have these single cell data sets that are coming out, which are these very robust sort of atlases that are growing about the specific genetic configuration of like all the different cell types in your body. And then on the other side, well, I think of it as on the other side, you also have these really robust clinical data sets that are growing about sort of drug trial data, animal data from preclinical drug work, and then also just clinical data coming out of clinical environments, whether they're with approved drugs or not approved drugs yet. And so you have these massive data sets about the genetics and the environment, and you have these massive data sets about outcomes. And real world evidence is a really nice way to try to correlate them and find out what's the, how do you find causality or correlation in the middle in a way that you can build therapeutic strategies against. And I think there's a lot of low-hanging fruit there that's going to be interesting. If you take that to even another level, you can also talk about applying ML and AI to that data. And a lot of real-world evidence approaches do that too. And that's again, broadly like causation and correlation. And it's extremely powerful, and it's leading us to all sorts of new approaches, especially in cancer. What we try to do at Octant is we think there's something in the middle of those two areas, which we think are the biochemical mechanisms of the cell. And really the strategy of Octant is to, as exhaustively as possible, generate the data sets that show how the data on this side is actually impacting the biochemical mechanisms of the cell, and then how the biochemical mechanisms of the cell are related to the outcomes. And by doing that, we believe we're going to get access to a lot more different therapeutic possibilities, because ultimately, what is a drug? It's really a way to perturb the biochemical mechanisms of your cells for the most part. There's some exceptions. And so I do think thinking about the world in that data abstracted way, there are a lot of opportunities for real world evidence. There are a lot of opportunities for AI and ML approaches. And then there are also a lot of opportunities for creating proprietary data sets that sit in the middle of those models that unlock a lot of the value in those existing data sets.
Fantastic, thank you.
Awesome. Well, thank you so much, Ramsey, for this awesome discussion. I think you hit on a bunch of important and valuable points. I personally enjoyed our discussion a lot, and I know it's a sentiment that the whole community expresses when we thank you for your time and your insight into this awesome adventure that you're you and Octant are taking.
Yeah, thank you guys. I'm a big fan of South Park Commons. I'm also really passionate about getting a lot more of all of you more involved in biology. Please don't hesitate to reach out if I can connect you to people, answer questions. If there's any way I can help marshal more support for these areas in the South Park Commons community. This is really even beyond Octant, it's a movement for me. I want more really smart people like you guys working on these problems. I think there's a lot of exciting, rewarding work to be done in this space. So any way I can be helpful, don't hesitate to reach out.
Thank you so much, Ramsey. Thank you for taking the time, for offering for us to follow up with you. Fun fact, I heard you lived in Greece, so ευχαριστώ πάρα πολύ.
Oh, yeah, I grew up there until I was 10.
I'm from Albania, so we should chat. Okay,
Oh,
thanks
awesome.
everyone.
Yeah.
Thank
You
you.
guys.
Bye.
Bye.